In Living Color. Living Color was, I used to tell people it was the worst of times, it was the worst of times, kind of sums it. But it really was a great show. I felt like I learned everything about having to write under pressure. Is this work? Can you guys hear?
Yeah.
Everything about having to write under pressure by working on that show. We had to pitch so many ideas all the time. Usually it was every Monday morning we'd have to pitch, and it was usually you had to pitch Keenan 5 ideas. And by the next year, we were pitching almost every day. And it was so intense. I used to have those white heat type headaches. I'd be like James Cagney at midnight going, be hurting so bad. But one of the first sketches that I wrote was, oh, you always thought you were going to be fired on that show. Keenan really was Murphy Brown. He had a new assistant every week. He really did. And he was a 40-year-old white woman, ironically enough. But so you really, tried to make him laugh. That was the key. And so one of the first ones that I wrote that got on the air was called Jesse Jackson's Children's Books, and it was like Dr. Seuss's books, but it was like Hop on Cop, that. And The Grinch Who Stole My Stereo were the books, and they were supposed to be for kids in the ghetto or whatever, or like Horton Here's a Hoe was a good one. I know there's a hoe who's down there, and what's more, quite likely there's two, even three, even four. Whole family of hoes who hope to survive. Don't be like a hoe, just keep hope alive. And Keenan loved it, he just loved it. And I thought, yeah, that's so suck up to the boss. That's how you keep your job. So In Living Color was a lot of fun. The other one I remember writing was when Jamie Foxx, he did this thing, Wanda, the ugly girl. And I wrote the one where he was giving, he was giving Tommy a massage on the massage table. And I got that idea because, man, I had just the worst, just neck pains just from writing all night or whatever. So I got a massage once where they had that table, and I had never done that, where your head is in that little thing. And I'm like, man, this is a little trusting. And I immediately, as I was getting the massage, I thought, oh, this would be great for the ugly woman, And the laughs from the audience were, oh man, that show. I've never been on a show like that. When Damon and David would do the Men on Film, the audience you have never heard, and the excitement when they would know it was coming on, because they would have to put a screen up and they'd have them behind the screen getting ready, and the audience like, what? Go. And then you'd hear that, they get excited and everything, and they pull it back and they start screaming, and Damon's just sitting there and everything, and it was really a great show to be in. And now I look back and it's hard to imagine. I was working with people like Jim Carrey, who became a huge star. Jennifer Lopez was a fly girl there. Rosie Perez, let alone Damon, and Jamie won an Oscar. All those people.
But
So.
there's also those sort of fateful things where you don't know at the time. I met Lisa Kudrow at the Groundlings, and
Right.
Phil Hartman, and Lovitz, and Julia Sweeney, and people that went on to the Steinkellers that went on and ran Cheers. But these were just all people. Like, you never said, oh, John Lovitz of all these people is
Right.
going to become,
Right.
go on Saturday Night Live. But it's so weird because there's those moments in time
Right.
where you just kind of, you just feel like you're surrounded by all those people.
Yeah. Cool.
Anyway, that was a little side trip.
Zip.
Yes.
Hi, I just have a question about pitching.
Mhm.
You said you both were talking about acting it out when you're pitching. Is that something that you feel that you came to perfect? If you could just talk about pitching and your experiences with that.
Is that me or Robin?
Well, before you came, I was also talking when I pitched Romy and Michele. The president of the studio had never seen the play,
Okay.
and he didn't know what the characters were, so I literally acted them out
Right.
to give him a feel of it.
Mhm.
My feeling about it is, again, it's going back to this thing where these guys are bored, they have pitches all day long, and they don't necessarily, you got to keep their attention, but also it's a way to engage them and make them picture it. And I also had an improvisational background, as did Winnie, as did Larry.
I have an acting background. I mean, I don't know what I would do about pitching if it wasn't for the fact that my whole natural bent is to entertain. It's like really important for me. I don't I don't think it's right to go into somebody's office ever if I want them to give me money to do something and not entertain them. I mean, I maybe I'm putting it in a crass way, but I don't think of it as crass. In other words, it's not just a conversation, and it's not just talking. You have to. You
is
must,
a performance
you
for
must
money.
entertain, and entertainment takes many forms. Don't get me wrong. It doesn't necessarily mean you turn into a comic if you're not a comic, and if you're not a comic, you shouldn't be pitching something that's supposed to be funny. But I mean, you have to engage people, and you have to make them understand why what you're feeling about what you're going to write and why you're excited about it. And that means you have to be excited about it. On some level, you have to be passionately excited about it, I think. And you have to find a way to convey that to another that is in some way draws them in. And that's your job. That becomes your little, your little challenge.
Do you want to talk about?
Sure. I think you have to go with what your strengths are, And the biggest thing about pitching is in your very first few sentences, you want to get across to them very clearly what the show is about. And then everything else after that is going to support that. And that's what you want to laser focus in on. And you just want them to understand what they're buying, why the show is special, what it is about the show. However you need to do that, which is your strengths, you should do. Like the Bernie Mac show, they had to know the show is about, like I said, Bernie thinking these kids are terrorists, and he doesn't negotiate with terrorists. That's what it's about, So everything I said supports that idea. Chasing the kids, not taking this, whatever, whether I had to act it out or tell it to them. And I just do it because it just is comfortable to me, but you don't have to do it that way. But so whatever you're doing is going to support that idea, whether you're good at just giving examples of storylines or lines that the characters might say, how they're going to interact, anything that supports them understanding what that show is, because that's the thing that you want to stick in their head so they know what it is. They don't just think it's a show about blah, 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 da, da, da. They know exactly what it is. So you need to distill that as clearly as possible.
A way to think about it if you're not a performer is still the characters in your show. If you were gossiping with a friend about other friends or describing other people, so you'd be saying, oh my God, so-and-so is so cheap. I can't believe it. We were at lunch the other day. You want to tell these kind of things that would be vivid in the way that you would gossip about someone you knew, or use something to pull them in and get them interested in the characters.
Yeah, a good tip that I do, especially for not a performer, is if the show that you're doing is something that connects to you in a certain way, then talk about it from that point of view, because it will always draw them in. Like if you said, it doesn't have to be something that happened to you, but if it relates to something that happened to you, like sometimes I'll start a pitch by, one of the reasons I'm doing this show is because something really struck me about this type of thing, and here's what happened to me, blah, blah, blah. And so that thing right there is why I want to do this show, and that's what the show is about. So I'm always trying to get them to understand what the show is about, in those first couple of minutes. And when you say something personal, it actually draws them in. You don't have to be like a clown jumping up and down, You can be very direct and just draw them in. When I pitched the HBO thing, all I said was what it was. And before I could even start talking, and I was all ready to pitch all this stuff and everything, she was like, oh, that's great. And she started talking about when they could program it. I'm like, you got to be kidding me. I mean, she just got the idea, and that was enough. Didn't even need to know what all the characters. She started pitching it to me,
But also, too, I mean, because of, being on The Daily Show
Right.
and being on The Office, too, I mean, somebody asked me what it felt like to sell a pitch in the room. Well, there's nothing better than walking in when they want to buy something from you.
Right.
Whatever, either that specific idea or some idea. And don't you think that the context of you being on The Daily Show
I sold
and
the Bernie Mac show in the room.
Obama and
Sold the Bernie Mac show in the room. When I got done with it, Gail Behrman looked back at everybody and said, see, this is the type of show that we should be doing here.
and now I'll ruin it very soon thereafter.
I do believe that. I've also had that experience the first movie I ever pitched, I sold in the room or whatever. That was beginner's luck in a sense, but then then two different pilots in just the same way. And I believe for me it was how much I was excited. Excited isn't the same thing as nervous. You definitely want to find a way to humanize the situation for yourself, so you're always going to be a little keyed up, which is good. Adrenaline works. But I really believed at that point in time, like Robin was talking before about that. Oh, I'm sorry. Robin was talking before about how you fall in love with an idea, just the way you fall in love with a person. And then that initial thing of falling in love actually pulls you through when you hate the idea, when you realize the idea is shit, when you start to notice it has problems, just the way with a person. Then you go back.
And that's after the honeymoon period.
Exactly. You go through a honeymoon period with an idea and you go, oh my God, it's so wonderful and I love this idea. Then you go into a place, which is just like with your husband.
Oh shit, I'm married to it.
Yeah. It's like, how, can I do another idea? It's like, oh my God. That other idea looks so easy, and it's like, but no, I'm stuck with my idea, and
Still awake idea? Still awake?
It's just an illusion. What I'm saying is it's just an illusion, because every idea you will reach that point where you go, isn't there another idea?
Right.
And so you turn back in your mind to when you really loved that idea. And I've done that so many times with either with writing partners or with myself, where I've gone, what was it we really loved about it again? Oh, right. And I have to enumerate it in my mind.
I actually sold a drama in the room, and then I realized it couldn't be written.
What did you do? Did you
Well, the way that I sold it, it was a murder mystery in a high school, actually. And it was called St. Jude's 24/7, and there were all these cameras that were put up around the school. And it was told as if it was a show that was going to be done in exactly 4 years. And you knew where it was going. You knew that someone was killed, and you knew who was killed, but you didn't know the circumstances around it, And it started off like that. In the pitch, I just said, everybody knows what happened at St. Jude's, but not everybody knows what really happened, that day.
I love that.
Yeah, and as I was saying it, he thought I was talking about something for real. I just said it in first person. I didn't preface it or anything. I just started talking about it in first person. I said, everybody knows what happened at St. Jude's, but not everybody knows what really happened. In fact, when Jeff was killed, a lot of people thought, and I just started talking about the character and everything, and you could see him just engaged instantly.
Who were you pitching to?
It was the drama person at NBC at the time. I can't
Whoever.
remember.
Hey Larry, what's the
But
deal
it was the
with,
funnest
what's the
pitch.
deal with
it was
you
so much
and
fun because it wasn't comedy. It was
Larry,
this
what's the
murder
deal with
mystery
you and
drama.
wanting to put cameras up everywhere?
I know. I don't know
Larry's
what that
getting
was.
all the tape from the people who run the traffic signs.
But you know
the
what that
traffic
was?
lights.
It's all about. This is what I was going to bring this up to, and I'll tell you why. There's actually an answer to that. Whenever I write like television, it seems, I'm always kind of dealing with three types of things. And usually one kind of overwhelms the other, but sometimes they all line up. The first thing is, what is going on with me? Like, what do I want to talk about right now? What's important to me? I think that's where every writer usually starts, Usually it's the strongest thing, And a second thing is, what's going on out in the marketplace? What's happening out there? What am I not seeing? What am I inspired by? What's going on? I don't mean what are the trends. I mean, like, what's going on out there?
What's missing?
Yeah, what's missing in TV right now? What void can I fill? Maybe that sort of thing. And then the third thing is, what's happening in the culture? What are people when I talk to people? What's important to them right now? What are people hungry for right now? My ear tries to hear that as a writer. And so when I pitch a show, I check those three things and see if they line up in any of those ways. And sometimes they do. Bernie Mac's show for me lined up in all three. As a TV show, they weren't doing these types of shows, at the time, and I felt it was filling a void. Let alone, I also was really inspired to write what I felt was a smart black show, because at the time, black shows were kind of being pigeonholed as just WB ghetto shows that weren't really that good. And I remember somebody said, Larry, how come there isn't a black Seinfeld? And I said, because you haven't written it yet. And then I thought I should take my own advice and write it myself, you know. So that was very important to me, you know. And it was a personal show. I've already talked about that. Well, it was personal. And then I also felt there was something about parenting that was something that people were talking about. People, from my point of view, felt like they weren't in control of their children, that the children were running the show. In other words, children are terrorists. I felt that was the zeitgeist that I was feeling. I would talk to parents about, and I would see it on TV shows, I would see it on talk shows where the kids were just running everything, and there was so much narcissism going on where you give the kids anything now. Where when I grew up, it wasn't like that. You know, you ate after your dad, you know.
But my friend,
or that point of view, you know.
My friend Jeannie says we're the first generation that are afraid of our parents and our children.
Right, exactly. So, and I'm not like that, you know, and so I felt I want to do a show that's not that point of view. I didn't like the shows where the father was being bullied or where the father was real weak. You know, I wanted a strong father with a strong point of view, you know, and a strong relationship, you know, that sort of thing. So anyhow, so all three, lucky for me, lined up. Yes.
I just want to talk about that. You did put a family on the air that we had not seen, and I really appreciated that.
You're
and,
welcome.
When you talk, you know, you made light of it with the casting and stuff, but to see like this dark-skinned girl, I mean, if he had had a really light-skinned girl, and to see the kids in all different hues was really important. And some of
Right.
these battles you fought.
Yeah, well, they wanted to recast Camille because she was dark.
I know. I know.
That was the reason?
Did they say that? No.
They don't need to say it. I mean, I worked on Moesha where the showrunner was also fired. I don't think these things are coincidental. And I want to know if you would speak about the cultural tensions that happen on a black show.
Well, to be fair, it happens in all shows. It really does. You know, it's just that there are fewer black showrunners, so when it happens, so, you know. But to be fair, it happens in all shows. I've talked to so many people about this. One thing that really helped me was looking at the Mary Tyler Moore DVD, and I heard the commentary from Jim Brooks, who I got to talk to afterward when I was going through the Bernie Mac. He was one of the first people who called me and said, "Hey, Larry, you did a great show. Don't worry, fuck them," you know, and all this stuff. And I thought that was really nice, you know. And I can't tell you how many people I heard from when that happened. It's people like Stephen Bochco and people I had never worked with, you know, who really had great things to say. But in Jim Brooks' commentary, he almost went through the same thing doing the Bernie Mac show. All the stuff that they didn't like, they hated the show, they thought it was horrible, it didn't work. I mean, almost everything he went through. And the only reason he kept his job was because Mary liked him.
I listened to that. That's great commentary
Yeah,
track.
it's
I listened to the
fantastic,
same
yeah.
thing on the Mary Tyler Moore, the pilot.
And the
they didn't want to
rhythms.
put it on.
The rhythms of the show were different at the time. That was the thing he was trying to write. He did it consciously on purpose. He wanted a different rhythm. Remember, at the time, there were escapist type shows in the 60s, you know, Green Acres, things like that. They were single camera shows, ironically, but they had laugh tracks, but they didn't feel real. He was writing a real woman at the time. This was a woman we hadn't quite seen on television. You know, she was independent. She was single. She didn't have to be married at that point. She was going to stand up to her boss. You know, she ultimately was the leader in there. She was certainly the moral leader, you know, and that we had not seen that on television. That was huge, you know, and it was important for Jim Brooks to be authentic with that character. You know, everything else supports the authenticity of that character, and that's what Mary herself was drawn to in his writing, you know. And she supported that. God bless her that she did and recognized that, because we never would have gotten that great show. So your question is, it happens to everybody. It really does, you know. So.
I mean, one of the things about network TV, I think, is, I mean, I say networks. I've never worked in the paid TV area, and you know, I mean, I watch it. I guess it's probably different. You know, network has this way of wanting everybody to look and sound the same. We're sort of talking about this all evening. And I think there's two kinds of TV writers. Well, there's a zillion kinds, but I mean, I've always been like, I wanted to go into TV and make people look different and make people sound different and just have a different take. And I think we're all actually of that ilk. And then I think there are people who are really like, maybe out of fear. I'm not even sure why. Maybe just because they actually see TV differently. Like, I don't see it as any one thing. I feel really committed to the idea that it isn't any one thing. That we need to take it and almost like bend it to our will.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean? And then it's so stamped. Like, even with young white girls, it's like when I did my show, it was such an intense thing about how I just remember endless bulletins from the network about how she always wore the same dress and how come she couldn't look more this and she didn't look, sexy enough or whatever. They don't say that word, because she's 14, so they can't say that, but they don't like it that she was wearing the same clothes and that her clothes were like baggy, exactly. And I was like, well, because this is a girl who that's her closet and she doesn't have unlimited clothes and she doesn't have a hairstylist actually who lives in her closet and and it was like those were the kind of level of arguments I was having.
It's partly the form I'm blaming it too. Like I always felt like if this is culture right here, TV is about right here, and film is about right here. I always talk about good TV, good film, that kind of. I put music right in the middle there. Some of it crosses the line, some of it's a little before. Art is usually way ahead over here. It's usually leading the culture. So TV's kind of lagging behind the culture. It's usually a response to what's happening. It rarely informs what's happening or causes something. It's usually always a reaction to it, where art is the opposite. Culture is usually a reaction to art. We're still catching up with things artists did 100 years ago, that sort of thing. So it's really interesting, so that's what you're kind of dealing with, I think, in television, is because they're so locked into it always being a response. When you start leading and you start doing things that aren't a response, it's very disorienting for them because
there's been also, I felt like
my philosophy on it.
Although as much as I really actually loved Friends, I felt like it had this really bad reverberation because it was like after you used to be able to have people who were, Archie Bunker or B. Arthur could star in a show or, people who weren't just like these perfect looking people. And then after Friends, they just wanted people who looked great, who all got along. And it's very hard to have a comedy where everyone, all gets along. But this is just one of those stories that I hope you cut out. But at one point I was doing a pilot at Fox when Gail Berman was president of the network, and she's a very big woman. And, pardon me? Yes, she is. But we were auditioning parts for the lead, guy in the show. And one of them was
This is
adorable. Absolutely adorable. He was short, and he was a guy who'd been on another show, smart, by far the best guy, but he was a little chubby. And he was one of those guys, like if you watch the show he was on for years, some seasons he would be heavy and some seasons he would be thin, and he happened to be a little chubby. So he leaves, and Gail Berman says to me, yeah, I like him, but can you ask him to lose some weight? It was just really bizarre. And ultimately I said, you know what? I can, and he'll lose weight for the pilot. And then if the show gets on, he'll gain weight, and then he'll lose it. And that's what you're buying. But what a great thing. You always see the self-conscious overweight girl. But what a great trait for this adorable guy to be a little chubby and be self-conscious. But no.
It's I can tell him to lose weight, but that weight's going to go somewhere. No guarantee where it's going to land.
We have a lot more questions. There's a lot more questions out here.
Okay.
I think you hit the nail on the head when you said, art is like ahead of its time. Yeah. And then when you look at
sometimes theater goes a little bit ahead. Yeah.
And theater, but when you look at some of the classic films that, transcends times, your Clockwork Orange was ahead of its time.
I would say the novel was. I'm not sure if the film.
But what I'm getting to is like the Smothers Brothers.
Right.
I'm getting like your show, in Living Color.
Right.
Seems like any show that has any controversy.
Right. It gets close to that.
Is right
line.
there,
That's
and
right.
it makes people nervous.
It's true.
Yeah.
I agree with that. Yeah.
I was a viewer of the Bernie Mac show from the start, and I remember. And I.
You were the one.
An
old joke.
No,
it's an old
it's
joke.
a-
It's an old joke.
I remember noticing the decline in the smartness and the difference of it when you left. And I guess some people here may know the story, but I don't know the whole story of how and that happened. Do you mind talking about it?
Just in a nutshell, they never really liked it, and they were just. I think looking for a way to fire me almost the whole time. And when the show kept doing well, they kept getting upset about that. It's so funny because it didn't validate what they thought, that it wasn't funny enough, you know. And the night that I won the Emmy, Pete Aronson told me that he saw Sandy Grush on the bathroom and said, well, I guess we can't fire him now. You know, that was his response to me winning the Emmy for his network. That was his response, you know. And, you know, the next month was terrible. They would lecture me all the time about what the show should be and it's blah, blah, blah. And then Bernie turned against me during that point. After I won the Emmy, it was like our relationship got very weird. And you know,
Why do you think that was?
God, I don't know. It was just really sad because I wasn't trying to steal any spotlight from him or anything. I loved Bernie. I thought he was great. You know, I mean, it's called the Bernie Mac Show. It wasn't the Larry Wilmore Show. But I don't know. Maybe it was his actor's ego or something like that. You know, but it. I was only there for 2 seasons, but I think the show was on for 5. But it was a combination of Bernie kind of turning against me and the network finally feeling that they had a way to get rid of me was to use Bernie not being on my side to get rid of me. So that's the kind of nasty.
It's horrible. It's
Yeah,
heartbreaking. It's like
it was
someone.
very nasty.
It's like someone taking your child away.
Yeah, but
tell us about
at
that
the
thing,
time, I realized that I had 2 kids, and that show isn't my child. I actually have 2 children that they can't take away from me. You know?
Right on.
I actually have a life that is outside of the show that is more important to me than any show. And if I'm capable of doing that show, I can do something else. You know, that show it was only a show to me. You know, so they can't take the gift that I felt I gave to that show. And people, that crew, we were so tight. I mean, it was the hardest day of my life when I said goodbye to everybody. I felt like it was like the St. Crispin's Day speech, almost in reverse. But it was really, really tough, one of the toughest points in my life. So, but like I said, and NBC said, we'll sign you up, come on over here. People couldn't believe that they would fire me after the show's doing great, just won all these awards. We won a Peabody the year before. We won the TV Critics Award. Wow. We had been nominated for a Golden Globe. We had won the Writers Guild Award. We had won all these Best New Show awards. It was unbelievable. I mean, there were tons of awards. It wasn't even just the Emmy,
Right.
Yeah, the Teen Award. I mean, I could go on and on,
It just kind of ruins your fantasy life because you really feel like if I did something good enough and it was successful, then everybody would have to treat me with respect.
It was the culture at Fox at the time and those people more than anything else. So.
But the point is, talk a little about what we were saying over in the snack area.
Oh, those brownies were unfucking believable. Did you see with the little?
You have the one with the white chocolate.
I mean, you were just touching on it, but about how, because I think it's so important for writers and artists in general, but especially like in our world, in the writer world, where we're constantly being hired, right, or hoping to be hired. I mean, it's so important to have a certain consciousness,
right,
that will keep you. It's almost like a safety thing. In other words, you can't. Where are you going to take your self-worth from?
Right.
You can't really go the distance if you're going to take your self-worth from these outside forces that happen to you, right, because they're very buffeting. They really do run hot and cold. It's very intensive.
Well, just keep in mind too that you're the experts in your field. You are the experts. So you, especially, and you're the expert on your emotional life. And you're the expert in your own particular talent and your point of view. You're the expert in your own point of view. So, and people say, Larry, how did you get into comedy? And I said, you don't understand. I do this so I can get comedy out of me. That's why I do this. There was no point where I got into comedy. It's constantly coming out of me. And so whether I'm writing or directing or producing or doing stand-up, daily show, whatever, those are all ways to get it out of me. So you may be a drama writer. You may have stories that just have to jump out of you. So you're creating opportunities to get those stories out. Whether you're going to be editing something or you're going to be directing something or writing it, who cares if you get fired from a show? You still have stories that people need to hear because those are great stories. So there's going to be another place where you're going to get an opportunity to tell those stories. So don't worry about the job. It doesn't matter. Two.
I,
Shout it out. Oh, fake out.
I'm sorry.
they gave me the microphone.
Oh, yes, there you are. Okay, sorry.
Where are we though? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I have.
Can you raise your hand
Oh,
wherever
yeah.
you are? Because I can't. Oh, okay.
Yeah, no, Jan's talking.
Let's talk at the same time. I have
We'll
two.
go to you next. I'm sorry, you next, and then you,
Oh,
because
yeah.
she's been
Okay.
Jan.
Oh, me? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, we're looking at you, but we want her to talk. Sorry.
I got
Those are the
confused because you were talking about a ventriloquist earlier. I have two questions. I'm very, very impressed with how even-tempered you are. Just, your whole persona, and that makes it easy for me to imagine.
Wasn't like that all day, believe me. When I was working on those shows.
So the name of the drug, but seriously, when you were describing the beginning of the show and Sandy Grushow and standing up to all those demands, were you drawing your courage from knowing that you were supported by the star of the show? Did you just not care if you got fired or not? I mean, what gave you the chutzpah to take those risks?
Well, they had invested a certain amount of money and, time, in me. So my job is to deliver. It's not to take dictation. They paid for what I can bring to them, not for what I can reflect back. So that's my point of view on it. So that's what I'm going to do. That's what I was paid to do. The day that they fired me is the day that I stopped doing that. So that's how I felt about it, And so I'll use all the tools that I have to try to accomplish what needs to be accomplished, And that's
But
how,
you
that's how I approach it.
you didn't have any part of you that felt like, well, this is such a big chance. If
no,
only
no.
I do
No,
this.
no. No, it was all about the show. The show had to survive, not my career. I wasn't worried about my career. I was worried about the show. I was heartbroken if the show
Right.
didn't survive the way that it was.
Well,
That
that sort of relates
that
to
would make
my.
me heartbroken. Who cares? I've quit shows before. I don't care about that.
Well, my next question is there something that you've really wanted to do that you haven't had a chance to do?
Oh, you mean writing wise or? Second. What kind of question is this exactly?
Not like a drug, Larry.
Dim the lights just a little.
Pictured some other thing, but
No,
whatever.
no. I
Is there
don't
someone you
know.
wanted to do that?
Something that I haven't written yet, or something that I wrote that I wanted to do. Is that what you mean? You know what? I usually move on. Once it doesn't happen, I just kind of put it away and go. I guess the one I was probably disappointed about the most, we actually produced. Well, there's two. One was called Beverly Hills SUV Sport Utility Vehicle, and I loved that show. It was a show at a car dealership. It was in front of an audience. Jim Burrows directed it. It had a great cast. Henry Winkler was in it. He was so funny. He played this really horrible car salesman who just had the worst attitude. And I had everybody in that. We had an Israeli, we had an Arab, we had a brother, we had a Mexican, everybody was in that show. I thought, oh, this is like a Benetton ad. I was so proud of that. And the cast was hilarious, And the taping could not have gone better. In fact, we had to take a day off because Burrow said, this is going so great. We're going to take a day off during the whole filming of it and everything. And we did 2 takes of every scene. There were basically no notes during it. And in 5 days, it was dead. And it's just TV, and it was the hardest thing. And guys still call me today and say, hey, man, what's going on with that SUV? I'm like, it's dead. Let it go. Wow. But it was such a magical experience. It was amazing that it just fell off that fast. But, what are you going to do? The other was a script that didn't get made that was called Fat Man, Skinny Wife. And it was kind of my take on the sitcom. And I developed it at NBC. But they were just developing 30 Rock and Aaron Sorkin's thing at the exact same time. That was in 2004. That's how long ago those were being developed. And I ended up selling it to Foxx, but they didn't make it. But everybody, I still have some people who call me up and say how much they like that script. So that was a fun one.
All right, this, yes, who's been waiting patiently? Thank you.
Thanks. Hi. I appreciate all of your work.
Thank you.
I've watched every show that you have on this list and been watching them for a long time, so thank you. My question is really about the very beginnings of writing for network television, breaking in. Could you just talk a little bit about that and what your experience was?
Yeah, it happened pretty quick. I was doing stand-up. This is about 1990, and I just felt stuck that the stuff I was writing wasn't very interesting at the time. I didn't feel very creative. And also I was stuck career-wise because that was like right at the beginning of Def Comedy Jam and that kind of wave. And the things I was auditioning for was like what Robert Townsend used to make fun of in Hollywood Shuffle, you know, it was all, you know, I had to be, every breakdown said fast-talking ex-con, you know, or urban, blah, blah, blah. And it just wasn't me, you know. And so I figured, well, if I'm gonna do something, I'm gonna have to write it for myself. One day I just made that decision, and I thought, I need to get experience doing that. So I thought if I go into television and learn how to write and produce, eventually I'll be able to just do it for myself, and I won't have to wait on the market to come to me. I can come to the market, you know. So that's what I decided to do, and a week later I had my first job, actually. It was at Into the Night with Rick Dees, that late night show. And it was just writing jokes, basically. And 6 months later, I got the job at In Living Color. So that's how I broke them. But I made a conscious decision to make a transition and to do it for very specific reasons. I didn't do it. I never felt a writer, like I was a writer in those days. I always felt like a performer. That was my identity, even though I wrote, you know, my whole career. But it took me a good 6, 7 years, 8 years to feel like I was a writer. That's probably why my self-esteem is lower as a writer, you know, because I never really felt that, you know. And and then after a while, I liked it so much, I didn't need to perform as much, and that kind of went
And
away.
yet you're back performing.
And now I'm back, and I'm having fun doing it. So yeah.
Yeah, you were saying to me, we were talking on the phone the other day in preparation for the class, and can you talk a little bit about just your sort of that you only do things now that are fun, basically.
Right. Well, I try to choose projects that are going to be fun, that I'm going to enjoy, you know. And now I only want to do things that are fun, exciting, stuff that I really want to do in terms from a real creative standpoint, and that are basically things for me to perform in, with a couple of exceptions. I'm producing a pilot, well, I'm supervising a pilot at NBC right now that is, it's called Outsource. It's about a guy who goes to India and works there. And it's going to be pretty much an Indian cast, and I'm very excited about that, you know. And because I feel like that's not on TV, that type of thing, to see a whole different culture, you know, in primetime network television. So I'm very excited about that. And Ken Kwapis is directing and producing, and, you know, we did the Bernie Mac show. To do that with him again is very exciting. And the whole Daily Show, just doing that is so much fun, you know. I feel like I'm writing, that feels like stand-up to me, which I'm going to start doing this summer, I think.
So do you write all of the stuff yourself that you do on the Daily Show?
Yeah, I write it.
And you call them and you go, I have something, or they say, will you talk about such and such?
Yeah, it's both. I'll have an idea, or they'll have something, you know, like, hey, it's Black History Month, Larry. We need to do something, you know. Or
that one was really,
or
that
something
was
will happen.
classic.
You know.
That was such a classic, that
Yeah,
Black History
Whitey
Month.
Girl, I think, was what we came up with on that. But it's a combination, yeah. And then I'll usually write it with Jason Ross, and I'll go over it with John right before we'll go line by line. But it's so much fun. It's really and it's the purest thing I've done since stand-up that is really my sense of humor, where I'm not writing for another comic or writing my opinion inside of somebody else's. You know, this is just my opinion, you know, my take on it. I mean, not really my opinion, but my comic opinion is what I mean, you know. But so that's so much fun. So that's, and the book too is another example of that. So I'm really trying to do things that are really, really even more specific, my sense of humor, with certain exceptions like Outsource and that kind of thing. So
this woman, and then you.
Yeah. Hi, Larry.
Hello.
I wondered if you could, I was interested when you talked about the tone of Bernie Mac and how you talked your writers into writing that tone.
Right.
And when you said once they go there, they'll never go back.
Right.
And what was that conversation?
It was a couple of things. Well, one was just getting rid of people's notions of what plot and what story are, because a lot of writers, I felt, didn't know the difference. They just thought it was the same thing.
Could you explain it to us?
Yeah, like I would ask someone, what is this about? And they would say, Well, I'll give you an example of a scene that someone was having a little trouble finding the right tone to it. It was Jordan was a kid was spending the night and Jordan wet the bed or something. Birdie comes in and he talks to Jordan, and they have this great little scene together. And he was just having trouble writing. I said, well, what's the scene about? He said, well, Jordan comes into the room and the kid is. I go, wait, stop. That's what happens. What is it about? You know, he says, well. Jordan has a sleepover, and I said, stop, okay, that's what happens. I understand what happens. I already know what happens, but what is it about, you know? And now he's really stuck, you know, and he's like, well, Bernie sees that Jordan, and he's really struggling to find it because he hadn't determined it yet, you know. He just knew the events in it, you know, what was happening. And I said, okay, well, let's just make something up. Let's say it's about shame. Let's just choose something, you know. Okay, I mean, he just wet the bed, you know. Okay, now write the scene, you know. So he went back and wrote the scene, and it was brilliant. It was fucking awesome, you know. There was a whole behavior that came out of just that one word that he didn't have before, you know, just the way that he even approached him and that sort of thing. And, you know, what was happening in the scene was completely different, the events in it, you know. This is what it was about for the purposes of that, you know. Now, when I was talking about the difference between plot and story, I usually give this same examples because they usually work out pretty good, but basically, story is what something is about, and plot is how you tell that story. It's a basic way to say it, you know. Some stories have a lot of plot and require them, and some stories have very little plot, you know. And I'll give you an example with two Steven Spielberg films, Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Raiders of the Lost Ark. Okay? Raiders of the Lost Ark is a story that has a tremendous amount of plot, but has very little story. There are tons of things that happen in that, but the character is pretty much the same in the beginning that he is in the end. Okay? So there's not much of an emotional journey that character goes on. The story usually is that emotional journey that character takes, okay? It's not much for that character in that movie, but there's a tremendous amount of plot. A lot of events happen in there, okay? Close Encounters of the Third Kind, very little plot. This guy goes out to where some UFOs are and sees them. That's it. That's really it. There's a tremendous amount of story in that movie. The turns, the emotional turns that this character takes. At almost every single scene, there's like an emotional turn that Dreyfuss takes. He's almost a different man in almost every scene in that. And he's completely different at the end of that movie than he was when he started. Completely different person. And that story, that's the heart of story, is taking a character's emotional journey from one point and coming to a completely different point that he can only come through from going through this, you know. That's what story does. Plot is the way you tell that story. It's a tool. Plot is a tool. Story is the meat. That's the thing that you're tapping into when you're writing, is the story, not the plot. A lot of times we'll spend too much time trying to figure things out, and that's when you get stuck because you're in your head. Once you get in your heart and you start telling the story, you will unclog every single time because you're telling the story. You're telling what's really happened, the human part of it, the emotional part, you know.
Well, that's what I was saying before, too, for the people who were here when I was talking about Romy and Michele, was I had the plot and I couldn't write it. And the plot was they're going to the reunion and they want to impress people, but the story was about this friendship that fell apart when they were lying, and they really had to learn not only that they were okay the way they were, but it was about their friendship, really. And it allowed me to write every scene. But when you were talking about Spielberg, too, I was thinking about my favorite Spielberg movie, which is Jaws. Mm-hmm. And Jaws I like it best because it has a really good balance of plot and story.
Right.
You know, it's really about a guy who's got these primal fears, who conquers his fear and does become a different person. But there's that great, MacGuffin of the shark.
Right.
But yeah.
This young lady had
Right. So, but here's the thing. Once I made that distinction very clearly, I needed to abandon plot because sitcoms are such a slave to plot, okay? So that's what I needed to do. So I had to teach the writers to abandon plot, and it was very hard. I wanted them to be a slave to the emotional story, and that's why I wrote those signposts for the different acts, you know? So they didn't have to write to a plot act break. I wanted them to write to an emotional act break, You know, it was a lot different. You know, so it didn't look the same on paper, but it felt satisfying on screen. You know, so we talked about that a lot and what that was and how to do that. And it took them a couple of tries, but once they got it, they got it. And it was very hard for them to go back and do it the other way because it's a lot more organic to write that way. It's not as artificial. You know, it doesn't require a lot of tools that are technical tools. It requires more trust. You know, there was one writer I wanted to kick him all the time because he was so talented and he kept doing these tricks. I'm like, yeah, you don't think I can see these fucking tricks? I didn't say that, but it's like he would write the confessionals, and I would say, get inside of Bernie. You're repeating what just happened. I don't want that. I want to know his point of view. I'll get in him and write that. I want to know how he's feeling. I want to feel that, you know. When he's tired, I don't want him to tell me he's tired. I want to feel tired with him, you know. I said, that's what I want. So we did this episode where Bernie takes the kids to church to try to teach them a lesson, and he gets his own lesson in church. But the whole story was how fucking long church is. Excuse me. That's all it was, really. I know. That's all it was, you know. And the whole act, I was going to have the whole episode in church and just go on forever and ever, but we ended up doing a whole act. And it was so funny. We had one confession where Bernie's just going like this. You know, and he's just exhausted, you know, and that's the feeling. I always wanted to get a feeling out of the stuff we were doing, more than I get it. I wanted the audience to go, oh, you know, to feel something from it. So that's why the tone was very important, for them to catch that and to write towards that, you know. Does that answer? Okay. It requires a lot more discussion, actually, but hopefully that.
I just found that so moving. Fascinating, but it was like, oh my God.
I would get up and yell because it's so easy to get trapped. I mean, look, we're writing, and we have to have certain things that we do with our head. You know, you have to. That's what we do. But at some point, you have to abandon that and get into the heart, the human part of the story. You know, whether it's heartbreak that you're writing, you got to write heartbreak. You got to break your heart, you know, and write that thing, you know. You can't manipulate that. You got to write it, you know, and get into it and know that that's what it's about. It's not about all this crap. This is about heartbreak, and I got to write heartbreak. Now, and then once I realized that, I said, well, there's a lot of ways I can write heartbreak. So that now I realize all these scenes that I came up with, they're really not important. I can write heartbreak in a phone booth, for Christ's sakes. It doesn't matter how I'm doing it, but I got to write that. That's the part that's most important, not how I'm doing it. That's not as important. So my fights for the network were with the how. You know, they always wanted resolutions to that, and I didn't care about that. And I wasn't the first to do this. All in the Family did that all the time. All in the Family would end their episodes on story points, and many times would abandon the plot altogether. You know, and they would end it on just an emotional beat, you know, and it would just end. And it was very different at the time because all shows ended on plot points. They wrapped it up, you know, but not All in the Family. Sometimes it was very much left up in the air, the plot, but not the emotional story of that episode. That was.
It was almost like the plot was to get you to that.
That's right. To get the
Emotional
conflict,
moment.
to get what that meat was about, whether it was racism or whatever it was, they were smart enough to have an interesting enough plot to get us to that thing, you know, and they were very good too.
Right.
So.
Oh, hi.
You can tell I'm very passionate about that. It's very important.
It's honestly the only thing that matters. That's why I'm sitting here. I just feel so moved by that because it's so obvious, but we forget it.
Right.
We're everything in the business tells you that that's not what you should do.
Right.
And everything in our culture, especially for a man, you're just not supposed to reveal that emotional stuff. You're not supposed to talk about it. You're not supposed to have those emotions. And yet, what's the point of doing it if we're not going to dig in there? She does it too. I mean, I try, and I'm pushing myself more and more the older I get to just strip it away, strip myself away, and do it even if I'm embarrassed or feel like I'm exposing something or I don't know. That's where the meat of it is.
And
Yes, I'm sorry. Really, you can really ask your question.
I'll say this real quick too. And when you're getting notes on a script too, try to listen for what they're really saying in the note. I always try to figure out what they're really getting to. If they pitch me something that really doesn't affect my story, but it's kind of like, it's here and I want to do this. If that doesn't really change it that much, I may be more amenable to doing something like that, just to be diplomatic about something, or whatever. But if it's something that it goes over here and it changes what your thing is about, which sometimes that can do, making a simple move can really fundamentally change something. You have to hold on for dear life and not do it at any cost, because it will change it, So you have to learn to listen that way too, and to know what types of things are going to change the meat of your story and what things aren't that important to it. They're just an interesting way to do that story. But who cares? There's lots of interesting ways to do certain stories, So,
Hi, my name is Allison Dean, and I just wanted to say that your stand-up was hilarious.
Oh,
so
thanks.
Thank you for sharing.
It's pretty old, so.
But it was really
Thank
funny.
you.
And I also wanted to thank you for standing up for the actress who played Camille as a dark-skinned actress.
Oh, sure.
I really appreciate that
Oh,
fight.
absolutely.
And I wanted to know also about your show, the Obama show.
Mhm.
Is that, this may be a dumb question, but is that going to be a comedy? Or
Yes, it's a single-camera comedy for HBO.
That's it.
I don't think that's a dumb question at all, because somebody was actually talking to me at the break saying, well, that sounds like a more dramatic show, but I don't believe that Larry could do anything that wasn't going to come out bent.
Well, the show is...
You know what I mean? He could take the most serious topic and commit to talking about it and be honest about it, but it's that almost like the recognition laugh because he's being honest about it.
Plus, it's going to deal with, am I black enough? Am I too black? How black do I have to be? I'm constantly dealing with these issues, and that to me is what's absurd and funny about it. It's finding the right amount of blackness on any particular day. That's what the show's about. It's getting the right amount of blackness for any particular day. So every scene comes out of that.
Can I ask you a question, Larry? Because downstairs,
absurd.
outside the library, there is your Bernie Mac script. Next to it, and like clips from the show playing. Next to that is, it's right downstairs. There's a little exhibit, and then next to it is Antoine Fisher and his script, and then next to it is Spike Lee.
Wow.
Now, you're in great company, but this is one of my pet peeves, is the very special woman issue, right? Women in comedy, women in drama, women with other women. And honestly, I feel like, not to be immodest, but to be immodest, I'm truly one of the funniest people I know. And you sat in that room with me, right?
Very funny.
I'm not funnier than you, but and I
No,
really
I
resent just being lumped in with other women.
Right.
So if you saw that, would your reaction was, wow, I'm in that company. Does it ever bother you if you're just in it's 3 black writers, or is that just not on your radar?
I am not against black writers, Robin.
No, I'm not saying you're not against it.
No,
Okay,
I'll
answer my question.
No, I'll answer your question this way. I remember when there was a point in my career where I was interviewing for some sitcoms, and I think Seinfeld was the hottest show at the time. I had done A Living Color and another show, and a lot of my friends were working on some of these good shows, And Jamie Foxx was starting up his show, And I told my agents I want to, meet with Jamie about writing a show. So, and I remember saying, well, do you really want to, it's a black show. It's an urban show, that type of thing. And I thought, well, yeah, Jamie's fucking awesome. I wanted to write for Jamie. I'd written for him in Living Color. And I thought, at the time, I feel like I'm a pretty good writer. I want to make that show as best as I can. I had a lot of pride in wanting to do that, And so it was more of a turning something that, instead of saying, oh, I have to write on what's a black show, I wanted to go to that show and be an asset to it and have our show be considered a really good show, So if people say that, like if I'm in a certain category, if someone categorizes me, that's okay because that's someone else doing it. I have no control over that. But and when you said Spike Lee, I mean Spike Lee is
Spike Lee.
Yeah, exactly. I'm happy to be in the same group as Spike Lee. You know, Antoine Fisher. I mean, I don't know about that, but I mean, just I think he's not really, you know, whatever. I mean, it's an interesting story, but Spike Lee is very prestigious. I think so. That doesn't bug me, or to be considered this, that, and whatever in a category, because I think if people are considering me, I enjoy that. You know, so I don't stress about it too much.
I think you might be mentally healthy.
I don't know. It doesn't.
Don't spread it around.
Wait,
One last question. Two more questions. You,
Jill, and
then you.
Yeah.
And then we really have
then
to
we'll
let him
wrap
go
it up.
back and write.
Yeah.
I was wondering what your process is when you have a couple of ideas going on, like you've got the movie thing over here,
Right.
this idea, and then you've got the pilot or the sitcom or
Right.
whatever it is. Like, how do you separate those, or how do you divide your time in writing those?
It's a great question because it's not easy. It's really, really hard for me. I mean, I'm naturally kind of scatterbrained anyway. It's kind of how my brain works. So I naturally kind of am attracted to wanting to do a lot of different things. It's actually very hard to do. So I'll usually just pick one that I have to really focus on the most. And usually that's deadline driven, you know. So like the book is actually overdue. So I have tons of pages I still have to write. In fact, I'll be on a plane tomorrow going to New York. I'm doing a thing in Pennsylvania for the primaries. Sam B and I are going to do like an Obama-Hillary thing. And, you know, and I'll probably be riding on the plane, I'm taking a train to Pennsylvania. I'll be riding on the train probably, you know. So I'm just fitting it in here and there or whatever. And then once that's out of my head, then I'm going to really focus on the HBO thing. Because I can produce this pilot because I'm not really writing it while I'm doing this other stuff. That doesn't take a lot out of me.
So in a funny way, you don't really go back and
Well,
forth.
I can gather the nuts.
Okay.
Like for the pilot, I'm gathering nuts right now, you know. So all the little things about campaigning and all that stuff. Like I'm reading this old book about the Nixon campaign right now, and so I'll go back and look at that sometimes, and I'll watch the new stuff on Obama and all the little funny stuff that happens from the whole Reverend thing. Absolutely is going to be in the show. I mean, things like that. All the little bits and pieces of the campaign, I'm just storing in the back of my head. Sometimes I'll think of a story idea. I pretty much have the pilot story right now. And sometimes I'll focus on characters, but I'm not writing it. I can't turn all my focus to it and really get into it emotionally yet, because I just have to. It's too emotional. All my emotions are going into the book right now. I get emotionally involved in whatever I'm writing, because I have to. If I'm separated, it's too hard. I have to jump in. So it takes a lot of psychic energy, you know, if you know what I mean. And then when I'm done, poof, okay, I can let it go. And it's easier for me to edit something when it's done. It doesn't take emotional energy. That's all head stuff, you know. So first drafts, I say right from the heart. Second drafts, right from the head. That's what you do. Edit with your head, write with your heart.
Awesome.
That's my advice.
This is our last question.
Also, I'll say this too. This last, because I'll forget. I am scatterbrained. I'm absolutely true. Somebody was talking about, I think, career things or whatever. I always say, when people say take risks, I think the best way to look at that is you don't make rash emotional decisions. Like, to me, that's not taking risks. You make bold, thoughtful decisions, you know, in your career. That, to me, is what taking a risk is. Being bold and thoughtful, not rash and emotional.
Oh, I love that.
You know,
I really love that.
And there really is a difference. You know, when you're bold and thoughtful, I feel like you're making a contribution, you know, whether it's a contribution from your vulnerability or something, or whatever it is, you know. And that's also my definition of good art. Good art is art that makes a contribution. It leaves something in the culture that wasn't there before. And I think bad art takes something away. Something is lost in the culture that was there before that may have been valuable. And you can always tell good art from bad art, because you just ask, is it making a contribution, or are we losing something by it? You know, so that's my opinion.
I love that. I love bold and thoughtful.
Bold and thoughtful instead of rash, emotional.
And emotional.
They're both taking risks. One, I think, is a poor risk. The other, I think, is a good risk. You're betting, you know, on something better, I think.
I love that.
My name is Monique, and I actually have 2 questions. First, suppose you have an idea.
2 questions. The first one, and then the last question.
Suppose you have an idea that's never been seen on TV before. So executives are always requesting it from your agent. But the very reason they request it is ultimately the reason that they say they don't want to move in that direction.
Yeah, that happens all the time.
How do you overcome that?
You can't. You really can't.
Okay.
Because in the end, you're at the mercy of what they're going to buy anyway. So that's why I say I like juggling those 3 things. And I try to be smart about the marketplace as much as possible, because you are selling something and it is show business, you know. But at the same time, you know, you want to follow something that you really want to write. And if it's something that's not on, you got to go for that, you know, and hope that you're in the right place that wants to take that chance at that time. Some people do, you know, you never know. You might be, you know, in that lucky place at that time. But you just can't count on it, and there's nothing you can do about it.
And then my other question is, as a new writer, what's the best way to get your first gig nowadays?
Comedy or drama?
Drama.
Good, because it's really hard in comedy right now. Write as many specs as you can for good shows. Try to choose at least, I would say write at least 3 and make sure that they're all different in tone and kind of style. You really want to show, because when you're going to write on a show, a lot of people write original material, which is okay, but keep in mind, if you're trying to get a job on a show, you're going to be writing someone else's thing. So you want to show your ability to do that, your skill in doing that. You know, because writing on a TV show requires a lot of skill. You know, you're producing something every single week, you know, and it requires a lot out of you from a technical standpoint, you know. So you want to show that you can do that. And you want, and hopefully one of those, hopefully at least one, is going to have something special in it that your agent will be able to get noticed, you know. Use every contact you have, try to get in somewhere. Writer's assistant is not a bad way to go. Sometimes you can get noticed as a writer's assistant. Everybody always needs a really good writer's assistant, Tim. So those are some of the ways. There's a lot of others that I'm sure people do too. So.
Larry Wilmore.
Larry
Wilmore!
Thank you, everybody.